This is a tour commemorating Evacuation Day. Today is the 237th anniversary of the day Washington returned to New York at the end of the Revolutionary War, November 25th, 1783. And some of you might know that Washington lost the city at the end of 1776. So for 7 years, American forces have been exiled from the city, as it has been the base of British command and operation throughout the war. At last, they are leaving the city, and Washington and his men are nearby, preparing to make their triumphant entry into the city. Now, a little bit about where we are before we begin our walk. We're here at City Hall Park. So this is City Hall Park. At that time, it was the town commons, or the fields, and that is our City Hall. It wasn't here at that time. By the City Hall, you can see the Liberty Pole, and we had 5 of these Liberty Poles throughout the American Revolution, often a source of conflict between the Sons of Liberty and British forces here in New York, with many riots held at the site of the Liberty Poles. By 1776, the last one was destroyed. This pole was placed here in 1921 by the New York Historical Society. And to the side of the Liberty Pole, the foundation of the old Bridewell prison, which would have been a melancholy thing for Mr. Washington, or General Washington, to see, as 2,000 of his men held as prisoners of war died in the Bridewell prison during that occupation at the hands of the Provost Marshal, William Cunningham. And we're going to be talking about William Cunningham a bit more on our tour. So Washington's men have begun their march this morning at 8 o'clock from Harlem, and by 1 p.m. they are on the other side of where City Hall is, near something called the Tea-Water Pump, and that would be where the base of the Brooklyn Bridge is today. And they are waiting for the English to finish their evacuation. They are leaving from the port along the East River, and at the time when the British flag is lowered at the flagpole at the Battery, Washington and his men can begin their march into the city of New York. We're on Broadway, and Broadway was the main street of the town, so we're going to be going straight down the Broadway. And I just want to let you know that the first half of our walk is not going to be the path Washington took. He and his men will be parallel to us along where Pearl Street is today. But there's nothing interesting for us to see over there. All the good historic stuff is up here on the Broadway. Now, across from us is Murray Street, and you can see here a Brown Street sign that says Murray Street, and that Brown Street sign tells us we are in a historic district. And about 12 o'clock on November 25th, a lady named Mrs. Day, who was a great patriot and very excited, put out her new American flag. Except it was before the stated time that American flags could be flown. So Provost Marshal Cunningham went over to the Days in order to complain about the flag being out too early. Mrs. Day apparently was a stout, athletic, and powerful woman, very patriotic, they said. She got so mad at Provost Marshal Cunningham, they said that she boxed his ears, the powder flew out of his wig, and everyone on the street laughed and jeered at William Cunningham, and he kind of ran off in embarrassment. So today we want to salute the fine ladies like Mrs. Day, who stood their ground as great patriots during the Revolutionary War. And for those of you who watch me as Mrs. Q, you know that Mrs. Q was also a very feisty lady during that time. So let's begin our walk south on the Broadway. This would be a dirt lane. It would be the widest street in the town, the Broadway, obviously, and the main street of the town. And we're just going to come down here a little bit as we begin our walk into the town. You can see it's quite quiet today here. And if you have any questions or comments, please, type them in for me so that I can see them and be sure to answer your questions. Those of you who've been on my tours, you know I love to get questions because it gives me something to think about and something, fun to add to the dialogue. And we're going to come along here. And as we walk here along the Broadway, over on our right, which is just an office building today, we would have been passing King's College, which some of you know was the first college in the city of New York, originally started by the Church of England. And of course, it was the school where Alexander Hamilton and John Jay were educated. During the Revolutionary War, it was used as a hospital for British soldiers. And after the Revolutionary War, it will be renamed Columbia College. So this would be the original site of King's College over to our right. And over here, as we get down on our left to the base of City Hall Park, we're coming up onto the area that they did call the Fields. And the Fields is where the Sons of Liberty would have met prior to the American Revolution. So let's kind of set the atmosphere and the stage for our tour. It's 1783. The war is over. Washington is coming into New York with his young officers like Colonel Alexander Hamilton and some of his commanders like General Alexander McDougall and General John Lamb, who were all members of the New York Sons of Liberty. Indeed, Generals McDougall and Lamb were the founders of the New York Sons of Liberty. And over here to our left, where you see the fountain, is where the Sons of Liberty would have set up their platform and protested against the various acts that the British passed against the colonies. So right here, how many years ago would it have been? Say 1775 through 1783. All those years ago, those men would have been gathered here on the fields protesting against the British. And here they are in 1783, now officers in the victorious military that defeated Great Britain. So a great feeling it must have been for all of them to return to the city and the place where they began their rebellion against England those 8 years before. Actually, it started more like 18 years before, but we'll just date it to Hamilton's activities here for today. So we're walking down here to the bottom of City Hall Park, which would have been the bottom of the fields, and we're coming up to the intersection of Broadway and Park Row. Park Row, going off to our left, used to be something called the Bowery Lane, and that then was the main street, or main lane, I should say, that went all the way up through the middle of the island. And that's a continuation of what's called the Bowery today. And that just would have been a dirt country farm road that came right down here and joined up with the Broadway. So we're really at the intersection, if you could imagine it, of two dirt country lanes coming together here. The biggest structures on our tour today would have been King's College across the street and St. Paul's Chapel, which we're coming up to in a moment. So St. Paul's is going to be our first, big historic landmark that we'll be talking about and visiting. Well, it's very quiet here today, but it is great to be walking the route and remembering this great day in our city's history that we were finally freed from the British occupation. A wonderful day for everyone. Very exciting, they were planning the festivities for weeks, and the parade, virtually everyone marched in the parade, and there's a long list of people who marched and the order in which they marched, with the regiments led by Major General Knox, the governor and the lieutenant governor accompanying the Commander Washington, various regiments of riflemen, infantrymen, all taking a look at their city after having been gone for 7 years. And what they found when they came to their city after those 7 years' absence was not pretty at all. Some of you know a quarter of the city burned in 1776 in a horrible fire that September. There was another small fire in 1779, and there was a series of other arsons that occurred before the Americans returned to New York. That some of the homes that loyalists were leaving that belonged to patriots were mysteriously set on fire before they left those homes. So we're coming up here now to St. Paul's Chapel. Beautiful St. Paul's Chapel, built in 1766 and still standing in its entirety from that time. The church was originally built by Trinity Church, the Church of England, which is a short distance away. And it was built as the country church for the people of New York. So this was part of the Church of England, or Anglican, so it was a loyalist church, a loyalist congregation. That is until after the Revolutionary War, when it became the Episcopal Church of New York. But you can see this beautiful structure, this Georgian structure, made all of brownstone and granite from the New York area. All of the stone masonry is the original masonry. The steeple was added in 1795, so that's a little bit of a later addition, and it's nickel plated. This is actually the rear of the church. The front of the church faces the Hudson River because people preferred to enter from the Hudson River side, and that also is where the historic graveyard is. And we're going to come down here just a little bit. so that you can see the monuments on the window of St. Paul's Chapel, because that monument represents a Revolutionary War hero named Richard Montgomery, Major General Richard Montgomery. There it is, who was the first commissioned officer killed in the American Revolution. Major General Montgomery was commanding New York regiments at the Battle of Quebec in December 1775 when he was killed. He was one of the first in the battle to die. After the war, the Congress felt he should be commemorated, and they raised the money for this monument to be made in France. It was shipped here and then assembled later after the war and installed by the architect Pierre L'Enfant, who you can see also did the interior monument that you can see just beyond the glass of the window. Those windows, by the way, are the original windows from 1766, as are all the windows you see on the church. Richard Montgomery's body was removed from Quebec and interred beneath that monument, so that also is his final resting place. He was only 33 years old, I think, when he died in the Revolutionary War. So a monument to an early war hero, Major General Richard Montgomery, and just a beautiful New York City landmark. This is the oldest public use building in the city of New York. And let's head a little bit further south now. As we pass St. Paul's, we're starting to really come into the city proper, where we start to see a few more inns and taverns, some marketplaces, as we pass further south along the Broadway. Now we're going to stop up here by the corner and look to our right, because to our right are some of the newest landmarks in the city. But I also want to give you an idea of the geography of the time. So if we look to our right, you can see the wings of the Oculus, and you can see the curve of the Winter Garden over there, the glass, and you can see the new One World Trade Center as well. Obviously, none of those were here at the time, and the World Trade Center itself would have been in the water in 1783. The shore of the Hudson was on this side of the World Trade Center, or at least that building of it. So this church was a waterfront church at that time. Everything you see down there is landfill. And you can see that the street, Fulton Street, does tilt downhill just a little bit as we go to what would have been the shore of the Hudson. And we're going to continue south on the Broadway. So as first-hand accounts tell it, people throughout the city started coming out of their homes, out of the inns they were staying in, out of the taverns and coffee houses, and poured out onto the street to see Washington and his men pass by that day. It was a cold November day. I think it was much colder than it is today. And everyone came out to get a glimpse of the great commander and his men who had so successfully defeated the British on their behalf. So let's continue a bit to the south. I'm trying to think if I'm missing telling you about anything here. There was a marketplace over there called the Oswego Market, one of the first closed marketplaces in New York City. Most of the marketing was open-air marketing. But in general, after the war, the city was a devastated disaster, with so many buildings ruined in the fire, as well as buildings that had been occupied by British forces being kind of ruined by the occupants as well. So New York had a lot of rebuilding to do after the war was completed. Now, I mentioned a couple times the fire of 1776, and after we cross the street, we'll stop and I'll give you an idea of the breadth and the scope of that fire. This is a pretty good spot. So if we stop here for a moment and we look straight ahead down the Broadway, to the right we can begin to see the outline of Trinity Church. The fire went along Broadway from Trinity Church, past us, and all the way up to St. Paul's Chapel to the right. And you can see St. Paul's right there. And it burned everything between Trinity Church and St. Paul's Chapel, from Broadway to the Hudson River. So that's an enormous amount of structures that were burned in the fire. And there was some structures burned on the other side of the Broadway as well, but we really can't see that area. That area was known as the Holy Ground back there, as it was all owned by Trinity Church. Trinity is right here and was the town church. St. Paul's is right there. We just passed it. That was the country church. So you're getting an idea of how small New York City was, that the town church and the country church were still so close together, but were still distinct congregations. Let's head this way. With people living more in the country going to St. Paul's, or some people who were wealthy enough to have a home here on the lower Broadway and a home up there in the country might use each church depending on which home they were in at the time. Although after the Revolutionary War, the wealth structure, as you can imagine, changed in the city as many people lost a good deal of their wealth during and after the war. So we're going to come up here now to Maiden Lane. And we're going to just take a quick look to the left on Maiden Lane, because when we look down Maiden Lane, we notice a few things. That all of our street signs now have turned black, which tells us we're in the colonial district. And when we take a look down Maiden Lane, look at the street, the way it curves. These are the original colonial streets of New York, these little streets that twist and turn, and the black street signs tell us we're in that preserved colonial district. So this is Maiden Lane running this way. So this is Maiden Lane going this way down to the East River. So the East River is this way, the harbor is that way, and the Hudson River is that way. And you can see that the East River would have only been 4 blocks in that direction. The Hudson River only 2 blocks in that direction. And we could see that Broadway is elevated between those 2 rivers, making it a very nice place to live at that time. From here, you would have been able to see to New Jersey to the west and to Brooklyn to the east. And we're going to continue heading south toward the Battery. And if you look south, you can already see what would have been the end of New York City. That last building on the right, and you see a little bit of sun behind it, was number 1 Broadway, and it was either the first or last house in the town, depending on which direction you were walking in. And some of you might know, in the summer of 1776, number 1 Broadway served as the headquarters for General Washington. It wouldn't take long for New York to begin to rebuild. As New York began reestablishing trade relationships and engaging in trade again, the city slowly was rebuilt. But on that day, in 1783, we would have had burnt out structures on the other side of the street, an old dirt road, and a pretty dismal and sad looking city. But none of that took away from the incredible excitement people were feeling at the return of their army and their commander, Commander Washington. And as we come up here, we're going to be joining up with that parade route that Washington himself took. At this time, they would have been walking along Pearl Street, along the water, as that was the dock area, and at that time that was the center of the town's commerce, and that really is where all the people would have gathered. That was more a business type of district, more people lived in that direction, and that would have been just a more populous and a more popular area for them to walk through than it is today. And this is one of my favorite spots to stop on a tour when there's no traffic, because that way you can see Brooklyn. You can see all the way across to Brooklyn. And to the right, you can see all the way across to New Jersey. So it gives you an idea of the elevation of Broadway right here, that you can see New Jersey and Brooklyn from this spot. So you get an idea of this elevation of the Broadway and why it was such a coveted street to live on. So if you had your nice 2- or 3-story home on the Broadway, you were living above the whole rest of the town, you looked out over everything, and it was the most in-demand area of the city in which to live. And you can see we're coming up on Trinity Church now. So the parade would have been proceeding to our left and would have been coming up Wall Street to Trinity Church, where they then turned and went down to the Battery. This Trinity Church that you're seeing now was built in 1846, and it is the 3rd Trinity Church on that site. The original church was built by the Church of England in 1698, and it was burned in that fire of 1776. So as the parade came by here, they noted that they came by the burnt remains of Trinity Church. And this was the first time many of those men, including Washington, would have seen the burnt remains of Trinity Church. And it would have been shocking to them. Trinity Church, that first church, was the tallest thing on Manhattan Island, a revered and beautiful building. And I can only imagine it must have been quite emotional for them to come by and see the burnt out remains of the church. A second church was built on the site, and that church had damage from a snowstorm. The roof collapsed, or partially collapsed, and in 1846, this beautiful Gothic revivalist cathedral was built in its place. Trinity Church, by the way, once owned all of the land from here on Wall Street up to Greenwich Village, from Broadway to Greenwich Street. They still own more than half of that today, making them one of the wealthiest church parishes in the country. And you can see this nice new modern office building that they just built earlier this year. So that's their office building that they use to administer their church, their charities, and all of their real estate holdings, which are massive. There are many commercial buildings and hotels that are on land still owned by Trinity Church, and they get their leases in 99-year leases. And you know, we might want to cross over, because I would like to point out a few graves in the graveyard. This is the oldest part of the graveyard, the northern or right side of the graveyard, dating older than the church to the 1680s. And this monument on the right is just a general monument on behalf of the men in New York who fought in the Revolutionary War. And you can see some very old graves along here. Trinity Church keeps the churchyard in really lovely condition. You can see how pretty it looks. All year round, it looks quite nice. And these are some of the oldest graves in the graveyard as we walk by. And for those of you who are Civil War fans, there is one Civil War monument in this graveyard for Engine Company number 42. And you might know that during the Civil War, a lot of guys went to fight as groups, as engine companies, or as entire church congregations. So this is a monument on behalf of Engine Company 42 that fought in the Civil War. I think this is the only Civil War monument in this graveyard, although there are some other Civil War monuments around New York City. And let's head this way. I want you particularly to see a few graves that are right here in a row, right on Broadway. Now normally, in normal times, we wouldn't be able to get down the sidewalk here because it would be so packed with tourists. And when I come through with my customers, I always would complain of how crowded it is. And I have to say, it's a kind of, melancholy being out here without a lot of people. It's a little sad, but still, I'm having a good time. So I hope you're having a good time, watching me. So here we go. I really want to tell you about this row of graves right here where they're doing the construction. And normally, when you looked at these graves, you would see a whole row of flags along here because it's a whole family of Revolutionary War veterans. But the person I really want to tell you about is in that second grave. His name is John Morin Scott. And he was a lawyer here in New York City, and his law partners were William Livingston and William Smith Jr. They belonged to a group known as the Wicked Triumvirate, Whig lawyers hated by New York's Tories. They argued many cases in New York against the Crown and won them. And John Morin Scott himself went on to become a general in the Revolutionary War. William Livingston, you might know, was also a general and served as the first governor of New Jersey. William Smith switched sides and sided with the British during the war. So that's another story. But one of my favorite things about John Morin Scott is the wicked triumvirate once argued a case against the charter of King's College because it was an Anglican school and people were going to have to pay taxes to support it. And so they said people shouldn't have to pay taxes to support a religion that's not theirs. They lost that case. But when I was looking through old church records, I found his burial record. And in his burial record, it says, "Herein lies John Morin Scott, who was a thorn in the side of this church every day he walked this earth," which I thought was a great epitaph for him, something he would have been proud of. So this is his whole extended family here, many of the men who served in the Revolutionary War as officers. And let's head around to the front of Trinity Church. Trinity Church has just undergone a $100 million restoration effort, which you see is still kind of going on here. They're not completed yet, but they have done a beautiful job. And you can see they have out all of the greenery for Christmas. You can take a look at how beautiful this looks. And we can look at the exquisite entrance and the doors. Always beautiful Trinity Church. And if we look this way, we see Wall Street. And we see Wall Street going right down to the East River. And to a little bit on our left, we see the base of a statue, and that is a statue of President George Washington, because that is where Washington became president in 1789, the Federal Hall. So that parade in 1783 on Evacuation Day would have come up Wall Street, up the hill, come to Trinity Church here, and turn down to the Battery. And that's where we're going to go next, down to the Battery. Now, there was a grave marker here I wanted to show you, although with the construction we may not be able to see it. Let's have a look. I think you can see it. It's a little difficult to see, but it's right there in front of us, beyond the fences. There it is. And that is a grave marker placed here by the Society of the Cincinnati, and it lists all of the Revolutionary War officers buried in the various Trinity Church graveyards in New York City. So that lists all of the officers. Some of them you would find here, of course, would have been Alexander Hamilton, General John Lamb, my favorite, Major General Lord Sterling, John Morin Scott, Horatio Gates, and many other officers buried here in the Trinity Church graveyards. That commemorates all of them. And it is kind of hard to believe Trinity Church has been doing this project now since last year and are still hard at work on it. Although it does look like they've been doing some restoration to the graveyard. Look at this wonderful grave here right in front of us. I have no idea how old that is. And that little house you see on the left, all black, that black hut that's been built, is covering the Alexander Hamilton monument, both the monument of Alexander Hamilton and the vault of his wife, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. So they're either protecting it or they're doing some further restoration work on it. I'm not sure which, but it does look like they've done some massive restoration to the graves in the graveyard. And I'm hoping that one of those graves they fixed is the grave of Major General Lord Sterling in the back.
The statue.
The statue is John Watts. John Watts' ancestors were horrible loyalists, and his ancestor John Watts was a member of something called the Odious Six, the six most despised loyalists in the city of New York leading up to the Revolutionary War. And this is a later descendant, John Watts, who's buried here. Interestingly, that is the only monument of that type in the graveyard, because after that monument was built, the graveyard stopped modern monuments. So say one of these old monuments belongs to your family member and you want to replace it, you're required to replace it now with an exact replica of the original monument to prevent the modernization of the graveyard like that. So that is the only giant, I guess it's probably iron monument you'll see here in Trinity Graveyard. So here we go. And at this point, first-hand accounts tell us that at this point, people had poured out onto the Broadway to watch Washington and his men pass by, that people were hanging out of the windows of their homes. People were crowded out onto the streets, everyone just wanting to get a glimpse of the commander and his men as they came down the Broadway. And one woman said that it was so moving. She said that she had, witnessed the British leaving, and that they all had on nice wool winter uniforms. They were well fed, they were clean, they were boarding their ships and leaving. But she said that when the Americans came by, she said they were skinny and sickly looking. Their uniforms were old. She said some were even barefoot. And she said many people wept as they walked by, and they saw that these soldiers who had nothing were the men who had defeated the great British Empire on their behalf. And we can only imagine how moving that must have been. Or for us to even sit and consider for a moment that our great American armed forces began as a group of men who went to war only with the jacket they owned, with their own bowl, knife, fork, and spoon, with their own weapons, carried everything, and by the end of the war, didn't even have boots or shoes to wear. And that is the origin of our great armed forces today. And I must tell you that there were people in the British Parliament who knew that we in America and our armed forces would one day grow to be what it is today, who predicted the greatness of America and predicted that America would one day rule the world, and that they would either rule the world as part of the British Empire or they would rule over the British Empire. And those were some very wise men in the British Parliament called Whigs, who were not believed by many of the other noblemen. Had they listened to those Whigs, we might not be the United States of America today. We may have avoided the War of Independence. Then again, we may not have, as we were so different from England at that point. Many people believe it was inevitable that we would have had to separate from them. Now, as we're walking down Broadway, you might notice, if you've been on Broadway, these plaques in the sidewalk. And they're on both sides of the street. And each one of these plaques represents a ticker tape parade. And the first of those parades was held in 1898 to commemorate the 100-year inauguration of George Washington as president. And these go all the way up to where we started the tour, and they commemorate every parade on the lower Broadway from that time. And of course, as we get to the more modern markers, they're all sporting events and sports teams. Just to give you an idea how high up Broadway is, take a look down Exchange Place and look at how steep that hill is going down to Broad Street. So it gives you an idea of the elevation of the lower Broadway. We're up on a bedrock ridge, and that is why the subway runs under us, because it was suitable for building a tunnel. And to the right, you can see we go downhill again to what would have been the Hudson River on that side. So it's hard to see the elevation today because we have all these big buildings and you can't really see that elevation. But when you stand on Exchange Place and look in either direction, you can see that we're going downhill pretty steeply in both directions. And from here down to the Battery would have been the most exclusive residences in New York City. They call it the Mall, and all of the wealthiest families live down here on the lower Broadway. And we're coming up to a marker that's going to depict one of those homes, because it was one of the mansions that Washington lived in when he was our first president. It was the Macomb Mansion, and it's right up here. You can also see that Broadway is beginning to go downhill as we're getting to what was the end of the island. So people would have been hanging from their balconies, looking out of their windows, lining the streets, all cheering as Washington, his officers, dignitaries, soldiers, all marched by 237 years ago today, right about right now, while we're doing it. So it's really pretty fun to be doing it at the same time and place. And that Macomb Mansion marker is right here at 39 Broadway. So this was the site of the second presidential mansion. The first was over on Cherry Street near the base of where the Brooklyn Bridge is today. And it gives you an idea of what these mansions side by side looked like, very much like London, with the mansions right up on the street side by side, and then with large plots of land behind them going down to the Hudson River. Very nice area to live in, most in demand. And as we continue down, we're coming up to the bowl, which wasn't there, but we are coming up to the Bowling Green, which was there. And some of you might know that there once stood a statue in the middle of the Bowling Green of King George III, a massive statue of him depicted as a Roman emperor on a horse up on a pedestal. And that after the Declaration of Independence was read in 1776, where we started our walk, a huge crowd of hundreds of people poured down the Broadway onto the Bowling Green, where they tore down the statue. And some of you might know the guy who threw the rope around the neck of the statue was Hercules Mulligan, Alexander Hamilton's good friend and mentor. And they pulled down the statue of the king. They also knocked every crown ornament off of the fence, and that is the fence that is still here today. And we might take a walk over there so you can see where some of those ornaments were knocked off. And the whole statue, or most of the statue, was melted for musket balls for Washington's army. A few pieces of the statue still do remain. Well, there's the bull. And there are some of those bullets are in the Revolutionary War Museum in Philadelphia, and the tail of the horse and the saddle of the horse are in the collection of the New York Historical Society. But there are other pieces elsewhere. And let's walk over by the fence so you can see some of the tops where those ornaments were knocked off in 1776. So you can imagine Washington and his men coming here down the Broadway, passing by the Bowling Green, full of people cheering and excited, so happy to see them, celebrating their long victory. And if we could just go right over here, you can see the tops of the fence where the ornaments were bashed off July 9th, 1776. And that was where the statue stood. Now, there's a great story about the head of the statue, and it comes from the journals of Captain John Montresor, assistant to the Chief of British Engineers in America. And he says that they took the head of the statue, the Sons of Liberty, and they put it on a stick right up here in front of the King's Arms Tavern and made fun of it. They said they shot a bullet hole into the temple. They cut off the ears as a message to the king, you're not listening. And they stuck the head on a spike and put it in front of the King's Arms Tavern. Well, Captain Montresor said he was so disgusted by this that he ordered his men to confiscate the head and to bury it somewhere north of the city where it couldn't be found. And he said a couple of weeks later, he was horrified to find that the head was back on a stick, making its way around the town yet again, that they'd found it and dug it up. So he said he ordered his men to confiscate the head once again, and that he personally saw to it that the head was shipped to England to be protected. After the Revolutionary War, one of our diplomats actually was shown that head at a dinner he attended. Some lord showed him the head. So that head probably still exists in a private collection in England somewhere. Well, how disrespectful we were, weren't we? Oh, those awful colonists. Disrespectful, unruly, rioters, terrorists, lowlifes, dregs, drunks. We were all of those things. The great history of America, right? That we were all the people of England and Europe that no one wanted, all came to America and founded this great nation. And they worked hard and they fought hard so that we could be here today. Remember, the people who stood against the British stood to lose absolutely everything. Everything they had all worked for, they would have been stripped of their property. Their descendants would have had no right to their property. They would have lost everything they built here had they lost. So you could say all the chips were on the table for the American Revolution. One side was either going to lose everything or one side would gain everything. And here's another look at the Bowling Green Park. And this was a bowling green, right? They came out and they would bowl on the green, a type of sport like bocce ball. And the homes directly here around the Bowling Green were the most beautiful homes in the city. Even through the early 19th century, these were beautiful homes around here until they were eventually replaced by shipping companies and cruise ship lines, major shipping lines. And over here on the right is the Battery flagpole. So now when they came down the Broadway and got to the Battery, the next thing to do was to raise the American flag on the flagpole. Now keep in mind that all of this Battery Park you see here is landfill. So none of this was here. Over on the right a little bit, you can kind of, when this truck goes by, you can see Castle Clinton. Castle Clinton was not yet built. And when it was built in the water. So there wasn't a lot of land here. Fort George was here, and the flagpole was here, and then there was the water. And so they came down and they had their flag. The ladies of New York had been sewing that flag for, I think, 3 months because they wanted it to be so large, every British ship would see it as they left the harbor. But when they got here, they found that William Cunningham, the sheriff or provost marshal, the last person to leave New York, had his men knock the rungs off the flagpole and grease the flagpole so no one could get up there to raise a flag. And a young, I think he was a Navy captain, Van Artsdale, went to a local blacksmith, and they made some sort of rungs that he nailed into the flagpole as he went up, enabling him to get up there and finally fly the American flag over the city of New York on November 25th, 1783, the first time the flag would fly over the city. And it was indeed a huge flag that every ship would see as they sailed out of the harbor. So the harbor would have come up to just about where we are today. Now, after the whole scene and party here at the flagpole, there was one more thing left to do, and that was to have a dinner at Fraunces Tavern. So let's walk over to Fraunces Tavern, the oldest operating tavern in New York City. It is just about as old as St. Paul's Chapel, also from around 1766. Actually, I think Fraunces Tavern is much older than that because it's made of the Holland brick. So Fraunces Tavern might be closer to 1700. I don't recall the date. This is the Customs House, or it's called the Alexander Hamilton Customs House. This was built in 1907 or so as a customs house for New York City. Remember, our early finances were all built on trade. The harbor, the Erie Canal, the Hudson River, oceanic trade, all those goods came through New York. So we had a massive customs house in which to pay the taxes, import duties and export duties on all those goods. So this was that customs house. And for those of you who like architecture, the same architect who did the Customs House, Cass Gilbert, also did the beautiful Woolworth building a few years later. Oh, and if any of you are Freemason fans, if we look up on the top of the building over there, which is the Standard Oil building, we see pyramids and obelisks all over the building. Those were popular in the 1920s when this was built. And on the top of Brazier, which used to have a flame out of the top of it, which lit the entrance to the harbor of New York. And this building was built by Standard Oil in 1926. And it would have been part of that original Lower Manhattan skyline. All those new skyscrapers being built in the 19-teens and the 1920s. And you can tell we're getting by the water because the wind is blowing, and this is always, when I'm doing a tour in the winter, the coldest part of the tour. It's the coldest part today as well, because you can see the harbor is right there, and the wind is just blasting up from the harbor at us. And we're going to head south here. Now, the shore would have only been a little bit beyond the back of this building to our right, the Customs House. Kind of where you see the HRC, if you see it for Health and Racquet Club, would have been the shore at that time. And we are going to take a left here at Stone Street, which is believed to be the oldest street in New York. Now, these streets down here south of Wall Street were all laid by the Dutch in the 1600s. And they still mostly retain the same width and direction as they did when they were laid. And you can see how Broadway curves. I don't know if you noticed when we came down, but we came around a bend, and you can kind of see that bend there. Whoa. So this is Stone Street. Now, behind us would have been Fort George before it was Fort George, it was Fort Amsterdam when we were the Dutch colony of New Netherlands in the little town of New Amsterdam. And Stone Street connected Fort Amsterdam with the dock that was on the other side of this office building that you see blocking our view right now. So this street originally would have gone straight through to the harbor where that Dutch dock was located. Stuff would have come in and come up and up to Fort Amsterdam. Also, when we get down here to Broad Street, when this was a Dutch colony, Broad Street was a canal. Instead of bringing everything down to the docks and the ships, they built a canal and brought everything up into the town, which was quite efficient if you think about it. That canal was then later filled in and it became Broad Street, running parallel with the Broadway. And this is kind of, I apologize for the ugliness of where we are, but I guarantee that when we get to where we're going, it will have been worth it. Enduring how yucky it looks right along here. And this is Broad Street now in front of us. And just a few blocks on Broad Street to our left is Federal Hall National Memorial, where Washington took the oath of office. And some of you may remember that a year ago we celebrated Evacuation Day at Federal Hall National Memorial, and that was the first time I appeared as my colonial character, Mrs. Q. And some of you know that Mrs. Q has grown and changed quite a lot since that time. And you can see just some of the beautiful architecture that's down here on these old, windy colonial streets. There are still some very beautiful buildings down here. Some of New York's oldest and loveliest. Always a pleasure to walk through here on a tour and enjoy this beautiful part of the city. And we're going to take a right here, and right there, there it is, Fraunces Tavern. And as we approach Fraunces Tavern, you can see on the right side of the building are all yellow bricks. And we're going to head over and talk about the significance of those yellow bricks. This is, you can tell, all a historic district. You see all the buildings are old, but I tell you that these other buildings are about 100 years younger than Fraunces Tavern, which predates everything here. Now, right here, we're coming to the street. This was the original shore of the island, but by the time Fraunces Tavern was built, we already had a little bit of landfill here. And by the Revolutionary War, the shore was behind Fraunces Tavern, where Water Street is today. So we have these sequences of landfill. So let's go check out those yellow bricks. So the accounts of the time tell us that after they had the celebration at the flagpole, they came here, and that the governor had a dinner for everyone here at Fraunces Tavern. And when they came here, the whole building would have been the yellow bricks. And you can see Fraunces Tavern is on the National Registry of Historic Places. And there's a little bit more about the tavern here. So Fraunces Tavern is the oldest building in Lower Manhattan, and it was originally a home for the wealthy Delancey family. Delanceys were loyalists. A couple of them commanded loyal regiments, and they were gone after the American Revolution, as you can imagine. And they eventually sold their building to Sam Fraunces. This is long before the Revolutionary War, and he opened it as the Queen's Head Tavern. So the Queen's Head Tavern was the regular spot for the Sons of Liberty to meet and hang out. During the war, it was occupied by the British, and then after the war, returned to Sam Fraunces. So after they raised the flag at the flagpole, they came here to Fraunces Tavern for a celebration. Now, some of you might know that about a week later, on December 4th, 1783, an incredible event is going to take place here at Fraunces Tavern, just above my head, up there on the second floor, the Long Room. And that will be Washington's final farewell address to his officers. And that's the luncheon where he met with all of his remaining officers in New York, said goodbye to them, embraced each one, and then left from a barge that was anchored right here at the slip. And everyone waved goodbye, and General Washington returned home, and on his way stopped at the Congress at Annapolis and resigned his commission as commander, going home only to be a civilian, just George Washington, and leaving it up to the people of America to decide our future. And then, you know, the Constitution was written, ratified, and right up the street, George Washington later, 1789, was inaugurated as our first president. So the beautiful Fraunces Tavern, and there is a museum on the upper floors. I don't know if they've reopened the museum yet. And you might want to come around and take a look at the front of the building and the entrance, because it is a beautiful Georgian structure and would have been a lovely mansion right here on the harbor for the Delancey family. So I think we're finished. So thank you all for spending some time with me today, celebrating George Washington's triumphal return to New York at the end of the American Revolution. And thank you to Mr. Q, my cameraman today, who's out here with me in the cold. And of course, you can always follow me at patriottoursnyc.com. You guys are watching on Facebook. You know where to find me on Facebook. And I will see you again soon. And be sure to share this video with anybody you think might be interested in watching it. Thanks again. Have a lovely Thanksgiving, and I'll see you again soon.